We will open the February 21st working session of the Election Law Subcommittee on Voter Registration and Impacts of Non-Resident Voting. Representative C, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right, welcome to the Election Law Subcommittee on Voter Registration and Impacts of Non-Resident Voting. I'll just read the mission statement and then we'll talk about what our agenda is for today, or at least a proposed agenda. The mission statement is the following. At the direction of the chairman of the Election Law Committee, this bipartisan subcommittee is tasked with evaluating, consolidating, and reconciling various 2025 House bills concerning voter registration and the impacts of non-resident voting. Accordingly, the subcommittee will review the proposed legislation with attention to constitutionality, any necessary alignment with federal election law, and legal precedents. The subcommittee will consider historical context and opportunities to clarify current regulations. The subcommittee will issue a report to summarize its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. And the signed House bills were listed in the February 20th public notice for the subcommittee work session. They're basically the same as last week, with the one bill that we executed being removed. And there will be some additional bills likely coming in the future weeks as the primary election law committee hears the different bills and is then able to move them on to this subcommittee. And in keeping with our practice, if the subcommittee determines that any of the bills under our consideration can be promptly returned to the Election Law Committee, we will do so. Again, some aspects of this, the subcommittee report will be due out of the committee on Friday, March 14th, and that date will likely be the subcommittee's final working session. For scheduling purposes, I'd like to ask each subcommittee member to hold open Fridays from 9:30 to 12:30, excluding next Friday, which is school vacation week. And we may have some additional working sessions in March so that the report can be ready by its due date. So at this point, I'd like to, there was some plans to listen to a couple of bills, in particular, Representative Lane, who is on this subcommittee, was going to go over House Bill 385. Unfortunately, at the last minute, Representative Lane was called away on county delegation duties and so will not be able to join us until later in the working session. And so we will adjust accordingly. One of my favorite sayings is, "Blessed are the flexible, they will not be broken." And I will apply that this morning. So one of the things that we're considering in the mission statement is legal precedents. And I think there's possibly two main ones that are germane to what we're looking at. Well, there's a lot of them, obviously, but and election law always seems to be litigated. But the two that I think that are maybe perhaps most current and most interesting to us are the 2018 opinion from the New Hampshire Supreme Court of New Hampshire, and then the 2020 case of Caroline Casey versus the New Hampshire Secretary of State. There were and I'm not a lawyer, so I apologize to the lawyers who are present in this room. But I will go over this in my kind of humble way. and try to explain as I understand it. Basically, there are two questions that the New Hampshire House of Representatives and the Senate through the governor and the executive council requested the judges give their opinions on a couple of following questions from the law, and those two questions. I'll just for whoever might be listening to this, the first question is, by subjecting those who are domiciled in New Hampshire for voting purposes to the same legal requirements as those who are residents in New Hampshire, including but not limited to the requirements to take actions required by RSAs 261.45 and 263.35, and to pay any fee, which are motor vehicle registration and driver's license, and to pay any fees or taxes associated therewith, would House Bill 1264 on its face violate any of the following provisions of the New Hampshire or United States Constitutions? They ask about the Equal Protection Clause, the voting article in the New Hampshire Constitution, and the Equal Protection Clause in the federal or United States Constitution, the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And then the second, and then to my understanding, their initial opinions are that these do not necessarily violate any of those clauses. I can be corrected later as necessary, but then the second question is, by subjecting those who are domiciled in New Hampshire for voting purposes to the same legal requirements as those who are residents in New Hampshire, including but not limited to the requirements to take actions therewith, would House Bill to take actions required by RSAs 261.45 and 263.35, pay any fees or taxes associated therewith, would House Bill 1264 as applied to students attending a post-secondary institution within the state of New Hampshire who currently claim New Hampshire as their domicile for voting purposes, but who do not claim New Hampshire as their residence, violate any of the following provisions of the New Hampshire or United States Constitution. And again, they talk about the Equal Protection Clause under Part 1, Article 2 of the New Hampshire Constitution, Part 1, Article 11 of the New Hampshire Constitution, and then the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And again, in reading this, it appears that so it says, interestingly enough, I won't summarize the pages and pages that are in between, but they respectfully ask to be excused from answering the first question. And then they go on to say, and ostensibly because there was no developed factual record. And then they say they're unable to answer the second question as well. So but they've gone through a lot of different discussions about pertinent law and legal precedents. Then in 2019, there was a case filed by Carolyn Casey against the New Hampshire Secretary of State. And fortunately, we have, to our pleasure, Mr. Clementowicz from the ACLU, who actually spoke for the oral arguments on behalf of the plaintiffs, I believe, correct? Is that correct? And so this particular case had 5 questions that they were trying to address. And so just to give a macro view, first they answer 4 of the 5 questions in the affirmative, and then they decline or exercise discretion to decline the answer to question 3. And again, because it's not quote, determinative of the cause then pending in the certifying court. So again, to the best of my understanding, that means that it at the moment was not germane or directly applicable. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can be corrected on that later by Mr. Klementowicz as needed. So just to cover the questions here in this 2020 decision, are the definitions of resident and residence in RSA 21.6 and 6-A as recently amended effectively the same as the definition of domicile as used in RSA 651, such that the one with a New Hampshire domicile is necessarily a New Hampshire resident? The answer was affirmative for that. The second question was, is a student who claims a New Hampshire domicile pursuant to RSA 654(1)A, which is the qualifications for voting, necessarily a New Hampshire resident under RSA 21.6 as recently amended? Again, that is answered in Casey versus the Secretary of State as affirmative by the Supreme Court of New Hampshire. And then in the fourth question, I'll skip the third question since the justices decided to decline answering that. Then the fourth question is, relatedly, does an individual who claims a New Hampshire domicile pursuant to voting under RSA 654(1), Roman numeral 1, or Roman numeral 1-A necessarily establish a bona fide residency for the purposes of RSA 261.45 and 263.35, which are, again, driver's license and motor vehicle registration. And then, so that was answered in the affirmative. And then lastly, the fifth question is, given the definition of non-resident in 259.67, Roman numeral 1 for the motor vehicle code, are college students who reside in New Hampshire for more than 6 months in any year required to obtain New Hampshire driver's licenses by RSA 263:1 if they wish to drive in the state, and required by RSA 261.40 to register in New Hampshire any vehicles they keep in the state? Again, this was answered in the affirmative. So as I understand it, and I hope to be corrected by our esteemed colleagues and attendees here this morning, but as I understand it, you would have potentially students or other individuals as well who are domiciled, who then, if they choose to vote, activate kind of their residency, and then at that point they must comply with the residency requirements in New Hampshire, and one of which includes the driver's license and the other motor vehicle registration if they in fact own the vehicle they're driving here. So obviously these we want to avoid lawsuits and exercise as much wisdom as we can in creating these legislations affecting election law. So we're trying to make sure that we properly understand the legal precedents and consider them as we go through our list of bills and make recommendations back to the Maine Election Law Committee. Welcome, Secretary Scanlon, and thank you for coming today, and also Mr. Klementowicz from the ACLU. Appreciate that. We had, in case you missed the earlier introduction, we had expected to go through one of the longer bills for an extended period of time, but Representative Lane is fulfilling some county delegation duties at the moment, and so will not be joining us until probably 11 o'clock. So we'll postpone that, but I would be happy to invite the secretary to comment on my understanding of this so far, if you choose to do so, or if welcome. It's always good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And members of the subcommittee. I didn't hear everything that you were saying, but the tail end of what I picked up was you're talking about college students and residency, and the statute should apply independently whether a person is a college student or not. But when a person registers to vote in New Hampshire, they are claiming that New Hampshire is their domicile/residence. And so the laws that apply to residents then would also apply to college students who choose to vote in New Hampshire. The laws, and I believe the courts have said clearly that college students do get to make that choice. They can register to vote in the community that they are living in while they're going to college and claim residency there, or they can continue to vote from the community that they came from before they attended college, whether it's in the state of New Hampshire or in some other state. And so I think that distinction is important, is that the law should not, target college students, using the terminology related to residency and domicile. Whether in-state tuition is going to be granted and stuff to residents, that's a separate issue. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I only mentioned the college students in reference to the definition under Roman numeral 1A, where it specifically talks about college students. That's the context. So I wasn't trying to focus on excluding, but merely mentioning college students in the context of that definition. So, but thank you for that clarification.
So I don't know if there's any questions that the committee has for me.
So I think just my understanding is that once it does that decision to vote and at which point domicile and residency kick in, does that occur at the moment of registration, or does it occur at the moment when a vote is cast? I know that might seem, or check in to cast a vote.
Technically, a person has established their residency or domicile before they register to vote, because that is a condition of registration. So that could happen the day that a person goes to register to vote, or there could have been some event prior to that that would trigger the obtaining of domicile.
Okay. Does the subcommittee have any questions for Secretary Scanlon at this moment? Representative C.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm just wondering, of all the various bills that we have this year, have you noticed any that deal with other issues involving being a resident besides students? Well, I guess we do have that one about indigent people.
Well, I know there's there are a lot of bills that have been filed this year, and we're keeping track of them as they come up. But if there's one that you specifically are interested in, I can try and answer questions about that.
I was just looking more in general as to what you may have observed in the process of you going through various bills.
Mhm.
Whether there was anything that struck you as being different.
Well, again, there are a lot of bills that have been filed, and a lot of them are addressing specific parts of the statute, and a lot of them are related to the integrity of the election process. And I think the committee is doing a good job, and the subcommittee is certainly helpful of trying to consolidate the different ideas that are out there that are similar in nature, bringing them together and trying to formulate, a policy from those. But I can tell you that in my office, we have been working on a lot of things that we think will bring transparency and confidence to the process. But they are going to take some time to accomplish. And I think that we should try and understand, what that plan is and how it will benefit the voters of New Hampshire, especially those that are concerned about, things related to technology and, whether people are appropriately registered and things like that, as opposed to just inserting a bunch of extraneous pieces of legislation that may impact, the overall plan of trying to get to where I think we need to be. And so we're following that, and when appropriate, we'll speak up and let you know when we think some legislation, although well intended, may conflict with the plan that we have in place to get there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. If I could, I'd also like to just ask a brief question about absentee ballots and that process. So when absentee ballots are requested, I know in the request form that there's a check mark that says you have to prove that, or I am a registered voter. I mean, they acknowledge that the voter registration. And so ostensibly, if they're registered, all the qualifications have been appropriately addressed already in terms of citizenship and all those other aspects. So the question is, when a ballot is provided, does the absentee voter have to go through the same sort of identification scrutiny that a election day voter would have to go through in terms of presenting identification or something to that extent? Would you mind discussing that a little bit, if you could,
Sure.
please? Thank you.
So the absentee voting process is a statute that creates an opportunity for voters who are qualified to be able to vote by absentee if they meet the constitutional requirements to be able to vote by absentee, which is whether a person is absent or whether a person has a disability. And then the legislature over the years and more recently have added provisions to that kind of further identify what absence or disability means. And so they, there's a provision in there now that provides for if a person is working during the entire time that the polls are open, which would include caring for children or infirm adults, that's considered a form of absence that prevents the person from getting to the polls. And so they can vote by absentee. There's a provision in the statute now that allows for individuals that are concerned about a severe weather event, I think specifically related to snowstorms, that if they believe that their safety is compromised by the storm that's going to be rolling through, that could be considered a form of a disability. That provision was widely used during the pandemic when we had a major public health crisis that people were concerned about catching a serious disease if they went out in public. And so, for that time period or that election, that provision in the statute was expanded, I think, by statute and executive order to allow an increase in absentee voting. With that said, the requirements of identity related to absentee voting are not the same as showing up in person and having to show an ID. I don't believe that there's a requirement at the moment that requires a person to send a copy of a driver's license or something like that with a request for an absentee ballot. Historically, the voter had to sign an application for an absentee ballot. And then once the voter receives the absentee ballot and they mark it, they put it in what we call the inner envelope, also known as an affidavit envelope, and they had to sign that and send it back in. And for a while, the moderator was required. I think the language is probably still in the statute that said that the moderator would compare the signatures on the affidavit containing the ballot, envelope containing the ballot, and the application. And if it looked like the signatures were a match, then that ballot would be counted. There was a lawsuit that challenged that by an individual that claimed that their signature could vary day to day, and the judge agreed that a person's signature did not necessarily have to be the same as on both documents, the application and the affidavit envelope. And based on that, said that unless the moderator is an expert in handwriting and signature comparison, that could no longer be a reason to disqualify an absentee ballot. So as long as the names were the same on the application and the affidavit envelope, and as long as there wasn't a signature that was missing on one of those documents, it doesn't matter whether it looks like two different people signed the document. As long as the signature is there and it's the same name, the moderator is required to accept that ballot. So that really was the check that was in place on trying to make sure that the person that requested the absentee ballot was the same one that filled it out and sent it back. That is no longer there. And so, I think that that part of the statute needs some work to come up with a process that does give confidence to other voters out there that, the same people requesting the ballot are the ones that are filling it out and signing it.
Yeah, yes. Thank you. I've noticed that just in researching this factor, there are several states that do require notary publics and public notaries, and it seems to me that there could be a series of options. If you identify yourself to a town clerk or election official, or then, if you are then away and cannot do that identification, then you have a notary public, or as we would have in the UOCAVA for military, maybe military sign off of some nature. I believe that's part of the federal things, but I'd have to double check that. So I agree. I think it does, it could use some work, because it seems as if we have a qualification to vote process, and then a check-in verification process for an election day voter, but not quite the equivalent for an absentee ballot in terms of maybe the verification for check-in. So that it would be good to kind of make those as best we can on a level playing field. So thank you for responding to that question. Are there any, Representative Burnham?
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question, Secretary Scanlon. Do you have a recommendation, or have seen other states or anything that may come across that might be a better process to accept and validate absentee ballot voters?
The answer is I don't have a suggestion at the moment. It's certainly something that I'm willing to look into and work with members of the committee on to come up with a reasonable way to give that confidence. I think being on the committee, you've heard me talk about the tension between making voting reasonably easy, but also having the procedures in place to give confidence that the people participating are qualified is really important. We can't make it too difficult so that we're creating a situation where qualified people just aren't reasonably able to exercise their right to vote. And absentee voting by its nature does contain a block of individuals that may have difficulty accessing, let's say, notaries, if they're confined to their house or something. And so I think we have to be careful and sensitive to just making sure that whatever the requirements are reasonable. But there should be an expectation on the part of the voter that that they should be able to provide that confidence that's requested. So I don't have a solution, but I'm happy to work with the committee on finding one.
Thank you.
Mr. Newsom,
Thank
or
you.
Representative Newsom?
Thank you. As you discuss that balance between confidence and ability to vote, where do you think we sort of stand on that continuum currently under current statutes and policies? Are we in the right place? Is it sort of diminishing marginal returns if we go one way versus the other? Or what's your opinion on that?
My opinion is that we've been on the side of being too easy to vote. And that is reflected in some of the voter integrity movements and the legislation that we've seen to try and pull it back in the other direction. I think that the bill that passed last year that got rid of the affidavit process to be able to register to vote is a reflection of that. And up until that bill passed, I mean, a person and before the affidavit bill passed, before that, a person could walk into the polling place without any documentation, and through the use of affidavits, could have established their qualifications and then proceeded to vote on election day. And that's a very easy, open process, but it does form the question in some people's minds, how do I know that those people that just filled out affidavits are actually qualified to vote? And that's a very fair question. Any voter in the state has the right to know who's participating in the election process and that those individuals are qualified. And so when I think it's fair that those people question that process of being able to establish everything by affidavit. The legislature, in its wisdom, has pulled back pretty strongly in a different direction from that. I think that statute, as it was passed, is very rigid, and that there may be people that are impacted because they are qualified voters but may not have ready access to one of the documents that might be required to prove those qualifications. There are a couple of court cases that are pending related to that bill passing, and I think that there's also some legislation in that I think would temper what passed last year a little bit. So I think the legislature is going through this process right now where they're trying to, pull back on the statute the way it had been, and trying to find what that equilibrium is going to be in the process of doing that.
Thank you. That's very helpful for me as a new representative here. I'm not sure if it would be your office or the Attorney General's office would be the better party to ask, but how many voter criminal, either fraud or other, whether it's an improper voter, non-citizen, fraudulent ID, anything like that, how many cases on average a year do we see in the state?
The Attorney General's office is the one that prosecutes those cases, but there are less than a handful every election that they find where there was inappropriate voting activity that took place. I have not seen anything that they have come up with that is organized or widespread, but they do find isolated instances of inappropriate voting.
Thank you, Secretary Scanlon, for taking my question. Do you have any idea of approximately how many people who request an absentee ballot request in person versus mailing in?
I don't have numbers on that. I'm thinking, is there a way that we could figure that out? I'm not sure, but I will see if I can get some information for you on that.
Okay, I was just wondering because I know some people essentially come in to the clerk's office, fill in a application for absentee ballot, get the absentee ballot, fill that out, and turn it in while they're still there at the clerk's office. Essentially, it's advanced voting.
And that does happen, yes. I think, the laws have changed so much over the last few years that, at one time there was a provision in the statute, and it may still be there, that in that situation would allow the voter to present a photo ID at the time of, filling out the ballot at the clerk's office, and then the clerk would be allowed to put verified voter on the envelope so that the moderator would know that person had shown an ID, as part of the absentee process.
I would echo that process, because I know in previous years in business travel, when I've been anticipating being away during election day and overseas and would be unable to vote, I know I've gone into the town clerk and have filled out the application or the ballot on that day, and again showed my driver's license in that case. And would you know offhand, I'm asking for numbers that are probably impossible to remember, so I apologize, but approximately how many absentee ballot applications come through the Secretary of State's office versus local towns or city wards?
I would say almost all of them go directly to the local town clerk. That's the process. I'm not aware of anything in statute uh, that would require the Secretary of State to receive an absentee ballot application from a voter. If it does happen, it's probably just confusion on the part of the voter about where to send it. And if we were to receive an application in our office for a town, we would simply forward it to the town clerk.
Okay, thank you. Are there any additional questions at this time from the subcommittee? I think so.
I'll be around for a little bit if you have more.
We do appreciate that, and I'm sure Deputy Secretary Hennessy last week popped up several times, so we appreciate your patience with us and your ability to stick around, as it were. Mr. Klementowicz, would you like to come up and testify on some of the topics that you've heard discussed this morning?
I'd be happy to. My name is Henry Klementowicz. I'm the Deputy Legal Director of the ACLU of New Hampshire. It's nice to see you all. I thought what I would do is start by talking a little bit about the residency and domicile distinction that you talked about, and then the signature mismatching, which my office was also involved in, and then talk sort of at the end more broadly about other constitutional considerations that the committee might want to think about, the subcommittee. And I'm happy to be dragged off topic or answer any questions at any time.
Thank you.
I'm here to help. So initially, I think there's been a lot of confusion in New Hampshire over the years about the terms residence and domicile. The Constitution uses the word inhabitant as to who's entitled to vote. And at some point, the legislature in statute defined domicile when basically every other state used the word resident. And I think I can probably speak for everyone in the room when I say, I wish that hadn't happened because it just unnecessarily caused confusion. And so for a time, the definitions of domicile and residence were in statute were different, and they still use different words. And in fact, there's many definitions of resident in the New Hampshire statutes. There's 21.6, which is the general definition. There's a separate definition in DMV. There's one in the New Hampshire Aeronautics Act. I had to go through all of this when we were doing our case, but they're generally very similar, but there may be a word or two that's different. And so in 2018, the legislature, as you pointed out, was considering HB 1264, which would have removed, and prior to that, the key distinction between domicile and residence was that residency required an intent to remain in the state indefinitely, and domicile did not. And the legislature was considering removing that, and the governor and council asked for an advisory opinion, as you pointed out, from the New Hampshire Supreme Court as to whether that was constitutional. The court, in a 3-2 opinion, said it was, but opinion of the justices' cases like that, these advisory opinions, are not considered binding precedent in the way that other cases are, because as the court itself has acknowledged, it doesn't have a factual record before it. And so they've described it as they're not sitting as a court, they're rather sitting as advisors to a co-equal branch of government. And so, well, it shows the court's thinking on it, it doesn't definitively resolve the issue. So that happened. The court returned its answer. The governor signed the bill. And on behalf of two delightful young women, we challenged the bill in federal court. Ultimately, what proceeded in that federal litigation was, I think people realized, and the federal judge realized, that there was actually a lot of confusion over whether, in fact, now that the intent to remain indefinitely piece had been removed, the domicile and residence, in fact, mean the same thing. Do they cover the same group of people, in other words? Because it turns out if you go through the legislative, I'll call it a thicket of residents and non-residents in the DMV statutes, it's pretty confusing. And I actually had to consult a linguist at Dartmouth to help me figure out what part of speech the word as was in one of the statutes, because it turns out it can be like 5 parts of speech. So ultimately, in Casey versus Flair, so the federal court certified that to the New Hampshire Supreme Court and said, in essence, do residence and domicile now mean the same thing? And if you vote in New Hampshire, do you now have to domesticate your car registration and license? And what the court said was yes. With one, I think, important asterisk that I think bears on the discussion from last week that I was able to listen to a little bit, which is that you're only required, if you vote in New Hampshire, to get a New Hampshire driver's license if you drive in the state. And so there is a category of people, or there may be, who are licensed drivers and were licensed in another state who then move to New Hampshire and register to vote here, but for whatever reason, don't drive. Either they don't bring a car with them because they're attending school, or they're elderly and don't feel safe driving, or they, live in downtown Portsmouth and don't need to drive. And so for those people, they're under no obligation to domesticate their driver's license because they're not acting as licensed drivers. Everyone else has 60 days from when they establish domicile/residence to domesticate their driver's license. And if they don't, they're subject on a first offense to a $60 moving vehicle fine. And the way that this is considered by the statutes is that it's not a crime, it's a violation, but it's a roadway violation. It's not an election law violation, because it's not that you are an unregistered voter or an unqualified voter. It's simply that you didn't update your license as is required by DMV rules. I think the fine escalates to over $100 for a second offense. I think it's probably rarely enforced, but the way I could envision it being enforced at this juncture is someone gets pulled over, they present an out-of-state ID, the police officer asks them, "Do you vote in town?" "Yes." "When did you register to vote?" And they say, and it was more than 60 days ago. Now the police officer probably has probable cause to write them that ticket. So that's how I think they'd have to have committed another driving offense to get pulled over in the first place, but I think that's how this could go down. The other important thing to remember is that there are people in New Hampshire who drive cars that are not their own. And you're not under any obligation to register someone else's car in the state, obviously. In fact, you can't because you don't own it. So for a while, when I was a younger man, my parents owned my car. And so I would not be able to register it somewhere else because it's not my car. And so there are people who come to the state with their parents' cars or a family member's car. And so they're not under any obligation to register it. It turns out, and this was uncovered in the Casey case, that there's actually another category of people, which is people who are not registered, not residents of New Hampshire, and not domiciled in New Hampshire, but still spend 6 months out of the year here or more. They are not qualified to vote, but are nonetheless required to domesticate their car registration, which is sort of an interesting wrinkle that I didn't think about. And I don't know who that is. I guess snowbirds maybe, who consider their civic home to be in Florida, but have a car. I don't know. People who fly back and forth may not take their cars. And so they have to register the car in New Hampshire, even if they're not qualified to vote here. So that's sort of an interesting thing. And I think it points out that actually there's a reason why DMV requirements and voting requirements are not quite the same, because you may have 2 homes and you may have 2 cars and they may be in different places. Those people are only allowed to vote once, but if they have 2 cars, they may have to register them in different places. They're still only allowed 1 driver's license, but it's not quite as simple as it may appear on first blush. Would it have made everyone's life easier, I think, if in the beginning the legislature had simply said residency and domicile are the same? Probably. But that's now happened. They use different terms in the statute, but the New Hampshire Supreme Court has said that they're the same. So that's sort of the residency and domicile piece. One other fun fact about this case is that one of the people who I represented, Caroline Casey, who's absolutely wonderful, got so much out of this experience. She went to law school and is now a 3L at Harvard, which I think is really fun. So some good comes out of these cases, even if it causes headaches for all involved. On the signature mismatching piece, that the secretary talked about, that's a case called Cicito versus Gardner, which my office did before I joined, but I can talk a little bit about it. And so ultimately, as the secretary said, there's a process in statute where the moderator looks at the signature on the absentee ballot request form, and they look at the signature on the affidavit envelope that goes in between the affidavit ballot and the mailing envelope, and they compare them. And the court enjoined that for a couple of reasons. And then there were some other reasons that we advanced that the court found it didn't need to reach. Number one, people weren't being given sufficient notice that this was going to happen, or most importantly, an opportunity to cure. So because
Could you repeat the
an
last?
opportunity to cure.
Cure. Oh, thank
Yes. So at the time, and I can't remember honestly where we are on pre-processing, but absentee ballots are processed on election day. And so if the moderator had determined that the signatures didn't match, there was no opportunity to contact the voter and say, hey, we're rejecting your ballot for this reason. And if there had been, maybe the voter would be able to come in and say, no, that was my ballot. The other part is that there was really very little guidance given to the moderators on how to do this. And so it was being applied unevenly across the state. And so you had some precincts where like 5% of absentee ballots were being rejected, and some precincts where it was 0. And it was sort of luck of the draw on who the moderator was in terms of how strict they were on signatures or what they thought their role was in the process. And so it created this uneven enforcement problem, which is the type of thing that was ruled unconstitutional in Bush versus Gore. And then the third issue that the secretary said is that moderators are just simply not handwriting analysis experts. And there's some discussion. Interestingly, I was told that the judge from the bench, when she was adjudicating this case, pointed out that she's ambidextrous and could sign with both hands, and her signatures might look different. And the voters weren't told that their signatures had to match. Also, people who we're talking, of course, about absentee voters, and that includes a large segment of people with disabilities, including writing disabilities. And you were allowed under the statute to have somebody sign for you if you couldn't. And there was no way for the voter to know that that person assisting them with the signature needed to be the same person. So like if you couldn't sign it and you asked your son to sign for you on one form and your daughter to sign for you on the other, the signatures aren't going to match. You didn't know that there was any reason why that needed to happen. And so your ballot is going to be discarded. So that's sort of the reason why the signature mismatching case was enjoined. I'll point out that the state did not appeal that decision. Then sort of to your question, Representative Weary, Mr. Chairman, about the identity verification process for absentee ballots. I believe that the Secretary is right that it isn't the same process that an in-person voter has, but I would point out that if a person had their vote stolen by an absentee vote, we would know. So say somebody pretended to be me. I'm going to pick on Mr. O'Brien because
Please
I know
do.
him.
Please do on behalf of the subcommittee.
Yes. So say Mr. O'Brien, for some reason, decided that he wanted to impersonate me and steal my vote. And he sent an absentee ballot request and he said, my name is Henry Clementowicz. I live at 244 Marcy Street in Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
Don't dox yourself.
Yeah, I don't care. I'm out there. My address is public record on the checklist. And got that absentee ballot, filled it out and mailed it back. Number one, he'd be committing a crime, several crimes, felonies that would disqualify him from voting in New Hampshire forever under the Constitution and could lead to him going to prison. But in addition, when I then showed up to vote later that day, I'd already be checked off and I would know. And so we would know that this was happening because you'd have a bunch of irate people or some irate people saying, why am I checked off on the checklist as noted as voting absentee? I didn't vote absentee. But that hasn't happened. So we know that this isn't that type of big problem because we're not seeing that. And this is like a nice transition to talk about the general constitutional concerns that this committee probably wants to think about. So there's a lot of different parts of the Constitution, the US Constitution and the state constitution that govern the voting process. So in Cecito, which is the signature mismatching case, that was ultimately an equal protection and due process challenge, which is broader than the voting rights realm. It's just you can't target specific classes of people and you have to give people the opportunity to prove themselves and secure government rights, including voting. But there's also a specific framework that talks about how courts evaluate voting laws called the Anderson-Burdick framework. And it's
Say,
Anderson-Burdick.
Burdick, yes.
Yes.
We've seen a reference to that in
Yes.
many of the court cases, sure.
So there's two cases,
Yep.
U.S. Supreme Court cases, that together establish this framework. And basically, it's a sliding scale, and I'm just going to try to summarize it for you, where the court first looks at the type of burden imposed on the right to vote, and there's a spectrum from a reasonable and non-discriminatory burden all the way up to a severe or discriminatory burden. And then depending on how intense the burden is, the state's interest to justify it changes from something close to rational basis review, which is, is there a reason to do it and does it plausibly make sense, all the way up to strict scrutiny, which is there a compelling state interest and is the law narrowly tailored to address it? And so that's the type of framework that courts use when addressing these challenges. And so in the context of requiring, say, a notary for absentee ballots, one of the things that the court is going to look at is to say, okay, well, the group of people who are impacted by this, we know, as the secretary said, are people who are disabled and may not be able to leave the house, may not have access to a notary. Notaries aren't always free. You can go to the bank and, get something notarized, but it costs $5. So that's the burden. How intense is it? That would have to be proven by live testimony from, someone like me would go out and find those people and ask them and then submit affidavits and say, like, I can't leave my house, like, to get a notary or whatever it is. And then it would be balanced against the state interest. And one of the things that this people representing Mr. Scanlon would come in and say, and I'm sorry, it's always you, but it's what the law requires, is, what's the state interest? What are we trying to do? Right. And so number one, they'd have to come in and probably be forced to admit that there's, as far as I'm aware, no documented cases of absentee ballot fraud in New Hampshire. So what's the magnitude of the problem that they're trying to solve? How pervasive is it? That's a consideration the court would make. And then another thing that I think they'd look at is, like, does requiring a notary actually solve the problem? And so I'm thinking back, and this is a recollection, and so take it for what it is. But I vaguely recall there was a case of the only absentee ballot fraud case I can think of involved a person who had requested an absentee ballot like 2 weeks before an election and then passed. And their spouse said, and I'm using spouse because I don't remember the genders of the people, said, my spouse had told me they wanted to vote for candidate A. It was like their last dying wish and they didn't make it. And so the spouse filled it out and mailed it back. That type of thing where an absentee ballot is sent to the right house with the right voter and then filled out by someone else in the household, I would surmise would be the most common type of absentee ballot fraud and would not be solved by any of the bills under consideration, because you have the real voter requesting the ballot and sending it back. It would, but there's no matter what you do, unless you require people to film themselves filling out the ballot, which I think would be unconstitutional for other reasons, you're never going to be able to ensure that the person who's requested the ballot and the person who filled out the ballot are exactly the same person, if that makes sense. And so I think that infirmity would harm the state's defense of these types of laws, because the courts, I would argue, are going to have to exact a pretty significant scrutiny on this, given the magnitude of the burdens imposed, and figure out, is the law proposed, does it actually solve the problem? And that's just something for the committee to consider. I've spoken a lot. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Yeah. I do have some questions,
Yeah, great.
if I may. But there, okay. For the purposes of voting, you mentioned that there were individuals who had moved from other states, who chose to no longer drive,
Mhm.
or were infirm or for whatever reason no longer chose to act on their driving privileges or
Yeah.
capabilities. It seems to me that in some cases, we certainly recognize in statute that if a person is here in New Hampshire and has a driver's license and they're over a certain age,
Yep.
I think we're actually trying to change that to 75 now because 65 is, of course, way too young.
My parents would agree with you.
What's that?
My parents would agree with
Well, and the chair is also over 65. So I still think of myself as young, even if not everyone does. And so if in those circumstances where they have an old driver's license from Maine or wherever, Florida, and if they were here and for the purposes of voting, is it reasonable for New Hampshire to say, okay, after a certain period of time, we expect you to get another identification? There are non-driving identifications that are available from New Hampshire. So what's your
Yeah.
concerns with that?
So it's an interesting question. And I'm
you.
just going to sort of spot think at you if that's okay.
Please.
So if you don't drive in New Hampshire, you're under no obligation to have a driver's license. And in general, you're under no obligation to have any photo ID at all. If you want to vote, you're going to need, I don't love voter ID. I don't think that's a surprise to people, but I think that maybe the ship has sailed on that. So if you're not under any obligation to get a new ID and you move here so say you renew your Maine driver's license,
Mhm.
and I don't know, maybe it's good for 5 years. So then you move to New Hampshire and you decide not to drive. Well, so you've got this Maine driver's license. I don't know whether Maine law requires you to notify them that you are no longer a resident. There may be some states that do. Actually, I think New Hampshire is one where if you move out of the state, I think you're supposed to tell DMV.
Yes.
I doubt that happens, but and like surrender your driver's license. But in the scenario, say Maine doesn't require you to notify them. So you've got a photo ID that's been issued to you. You're probably not allowed to renew it in Maine because you don't live there anymore. You don't have to get a New Hampshire driver's license because you don't drive. There's no legal obligation for you to get a New Hampshire non-driver's ID. And it may be burdensome to do it. They're not free and you have to go to DMV. Maybe you have no other reason to do it because the only reason you need your ID is to vote. I don't know. Maybe once your old license expires, probably what the law would require you to do if you wanted to continue proving your identity would be to get a new non-driver's ID in New Hampshire when you now need an ID. I don't know. I guess I think, why should we be requiring people to do that if they're not, if the only reason that they're getting an ID is to vote, then you're sort of tying now the burdens of getting the non-driver's ID even more discreetly to the voting process. And so that makes it closer to not a poll tax necessarily, but now you're spending the $50 or whatever it is to get a non-driver's ID solely for the privilege of voting. Is it reasonable for the state? I don't know. I mean, I think that would be up to a federal judge. I'm inclined to say no, because there's no, it's one thing to say you need to present a current ID, but to say you have to, if you have a driver's license that otherwise counts and you're not driving anymore, what's the state's interest in requiring you to get a new ID? I guess is the answer.
So the burden of, so over time, people age and
Yep.
and their appearances can change
Yep.
radically even.
Yep.
And so a driver's license that had a 5-year expiration date
Yep.
that is now a year past its expiration date.
Yep.
Very well, the person may resemble, but not entirely match that identification credentials being provided by, out-of-state licenses?
So that's an interesting question, and I think what I'd say to that is actually if a close reading, my reading of the statute is that when the person checks in to vote and they present the photo ID, the ballot clerk is not actually comparing the person's picture to the person. I don't think that there's any legal requirement that you look like the picture on your ID. You're comparing the name. It has to have a photo, but people transition genders, people grow or shave beards, they cut their hair, they dye their hair, they get glasses. As you say, they get in a car accident and become, just look different. I don't think that there's any obligation, and if there were, then it would be every time you dye your hair, do you have to get a new driver's license? I mean, I think that sort of shows the problem with that. But right now, under New Hampshire law, I don't understand New Hampshire law to require anyone to actually verify the picture on the person. You're presenting an ID with your name on it and the picture. And the reason for that is like, why would anyone carry around an ID with someone else's name and picture on it? And if they do, they're committing a whole host of other crimes. If they're trying to, do identity fraud, but the picture piece isn't what's there.
You're right. It's not in statute. I think by practice, I often observe that the supervisors of the checklist on election day are looking at the picture and looking at the person quite often.
I volunteer as a ballot clerk in Portsmouth. I don't do that.
You have remarkable discipline.
Well,
All right. Well, I think that is those are some interesting questions that I think the Election Law Committee should wrestle with, and the subcommittee will try and wrestle with some of that. With regard to the question, it's been raised that there's not much of a incident of fraud detected for some of this, and it's my understanding, the Attorney General has a lot of different responsibilities, not solely being election law. And so I'm wondering if the resources are sufficient. We have a few cases, it's not as if there's an active investigation into every problem or issue that is being acknowledged or reported. I think so.
You'd have to ask them about their resources, and obviously the allocation of government dollars is a New Hampshire legislative determination to make. I can just say from my experience, there is a dedicated election law unit at the Attorney General's office. There's an assistant attorney general in charge of it who I hold in very high esteem. There's an investigator there who I hold in very high esteem. I think this is basically all that they do. Whether there should be more of them is a decision for you all, but there are people who do this and they look at it, and it's not like the Attorney General just is doing this and a million other things. There is a dedicated unit, and they are, but as I said, I hold them in high esteem. I've litigated against them. They're good people. And I've called them but when issues arise.
Right, for clarification
Yeah.
purposes,
Mhm.
yes. Enforcement. Are there any other questions from the subcommittee at this point? Representative Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for taking my question. I have a scenario. We were talking about out-of-state license. So first-time voter.
Yep.
First-time voter with an out-of-state license appears to the check-in
Yep.
or with a information of one residency where their vehicle is registered.
Yep.
And then has another document indicating the residency, which is in a different part of the same city within New Hampshire. I'm doing this. So 3 different identifications.
Okay.
One photo ID, driver's license from an outside of state, and 2 separate pieces of document from 2 different residencies.
Yep.
First time voter. So they get a pass. basically. They can come in and vote with that information. Is that correct?
So I'm going to quibble with your characterization of them getting a pass, but yes. So domicile and residency, the way I think about it is that there's an objective component and a subjective component. So you have to have a physical presence in the state of New Hampshire. That's the objective piece. And it has to be, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, but like your primary place for civic and social participation in democratic self-government. And so I think that there's a mental component to that of like a person has to decide in their head where their community is. And there's a few ways that a person can do it. And it has to match up with whatever objective facts there are on the ground. So there's no requirement, for example, that a person spend 60%, 6 months out of the year in New Hampshire, or even a majority of their time in New Hampshire. It just has to be like where you would do jury duty, where you would vote, where you would give to local candidates, where you would go to the school board meeting. Those are factors to consider. Under the current statutes as they exist, and they're being challenged in court, there's no more affidavits to prove any of your qualifications. So when this person goes to register to vote, they will have to prove to the satisfaction of the supervisors of the checklist that they're domiciled in the town or ward that they're registering to vote in. So that could be with a lease. It could be with a utility bill. It could be that they appear on a list of people who have a dorm at Dartmouth College in the town of Hanover, or some other document that is to the satisfaction of the supervisors of the checklist. But it's not, I would say, that they're getting a pass. It's that they're presenting documentary proof that they live in that town. And I'll say to your point that I think that probably the most common type of voter fraud, and I haven't done an exhaustive review of this, it's sort of anecdotal, but I think that the most common type of voter fraud in New Hampshire probably is double voting. And so that probably appears when people have multiple domiciles, not multiple domiciles, but multiple houses. So a person lives in Massachusetts, but they have a ski condo in New Hampshire or whatever, and they decide that they're going to vote in both places. First of all, they're going to get caught. But second of all, they're not going to get caught because of any of the documentary requirements, because they can prove all those things. They can say, I have a deed to this ski condo. I have proof of residency. The issue is that they're also voting somewhere else, and they'll get caught when the checklists are ultimately compared. So you can require documentary proof to say someone has a connection with a particular place in New Hampshire, which is what the legislature has done. But I don't know how you can ever get someone to prove that they don't have other places or have had other places. And one other point I'll just make to your scenario is that when you move within the state of New Hampshire, you're required to update your address with DMV, but you're not required to get a new physical driver's license. And in fact, they're not free. So I live in Portsmouth, but if I move to Dover, I have to tell DMV that I'm moving to Dover, but I don't have to get a new driver's license that says Dover on it. Mm-hmm. And if I did, I have to pay like $50. Was that helpful at all?
Yes, it is. I have a follow-up though. So the same person
Yeah.
in this scenario, if they go to vote again with the same credentials, they're already logged into the system. What then happens?
So they've already registered. So they've already proved to the satisfaction of the supervisors of the checklist their age, citizenship, identity, and domicile. They're coming back to the check-in table and they're voting again. All they're doing now is proving their identity. And so what the law requires is that they present one of the categories of documents that include government issued ID that has both a photograph and their name. And that's all that they're proving.
Regardless of where the ID is from, which state, so they can reuse that ID from another
They can.
state.
And I see where you're going with this. And I'd point out that I think that it's possible, given how late our state primary election is, that you can actually have 2 elections within 60 days of each other. Because you could vote like at September 8th and November 3rd, I think are within 60 days. So that can happen. If they were to do that, I suppose that there's evidence now that they've committed a DMV violation by not domesticating their driver's license if it's also proven that they've driven during that period of time. And if there were a police officer around who observed this, they could probably write them a $60 ticket for failing to update their license. But the mere fact that they haven't done that, here's my broader philosophical response to you, if I may, is the mere fact that someone hasn't updated their license doesn't mean that they're not domiciled and living in the state. It could just as easily mean that they're scatterbrained or busy or disorganized. I lost my driver's license. It just like fell out of my wallet. And so I went around with my expired license for like 3 months. And it's just because I have this job and I have a kid and it's like snowing and I just didn't get to it. Should I have? I definitely should have. But that doesn't mean that I wasn't qualified to vote in New Hampshire. So I guess I would encourage the subcommittee to think about, to hold in their minds that just because someone doesn't do these like bureaucratic steps doesn't mean that they're not actually living in New Hampshire. I understand that there are competing interests and that people may have philosophical differences about how reasonable it is to impose these burdens on people. But I don't know. Consider your disorganized nephew, maybe.
Oh, thank you.
Any additional, Representative Newsom?
Thank you. Thanks so much for your explanation, especially on residence and domicile. Are there issues with citizenship as well?
Yes, big time.
Could you kind of expand on that a little bit for us? Thanks.
There's a rule of professional conduct for lawyers that prevent people from talking about pending litigation with a represented person without their lawyer present. So I can't get too into it. So I'm not going to talk about the lawsuit, but what I'll say is that currently New Hampshire law requires documentary proof of all of your qualifications, including age, citizenship, identity, and domicile. From my perspective, citizenship is the hardest qualification to prove with documents. There's no document I'm aware of that proves all four. Some documents can prove three, like a driver's license can prove your identity, domicile, and age, but it doesn't prove citizenship. A passport can prove your age, identity, and citizenship, but not your domicile. So there's no documents that prove all of them. The documents I'm aware of that prove citizenship are a birth certificate if issued within the United States, naturalization papers, and a passport. I think the reason that I'm most concerned about this is that I think that's the type of documentary proof that people are least likely to have. I don't know about the incidences of citizenship fraud or non-citizens participating in our electoral process, but I can just say that those requirements are under court challenges and that there was a 10th Circuit case from 2020 where the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in St. Louis, maybe, struck down a Kansas law that required documentary proof of citizenship because they found that something like between 12 and 20% of people who were registering to vote were disqualified because they didn't have documentary proof of citizenship, but the state's own expert testified that at least 99% of them were in fact citizens. So I don't know if there are any bills that are under consideration with the subcommittee that address citizenship. But one could easily imagine, an elderly person who moves from their house into an assisted living facility in a different town or ward and now has to re-register, may not be able to be found on the statewide voter database. And when they re-register now, it's to prove their citizenship as well, even though they've been voting in New Hampshire for 70 years and doesn't have an original birth certificate, doesn't know where to get one, and doesn't have a passport. And that person would not be allowed to register. So I do think there are big concerns with citizenship.
So the main concern is really the proof of the citizenship. Is that?
Well, yes.
Because citizenship is already established as a legitimate requirement for voting, as I understand it.
Yeah.
There's other court cases larger than what we're talking about that have established that.
Yeah, so there are some municipalities outside of New Hampshire that allow non-citizens to vote for some municipal offices. So like I think in Maryland and maybe California, there are communities where non-citizens might be able to vote for school board. That's not the case in New Hampshire.
Right.
You have to be a U.S. citizen to vote in New Hampshire, and I'm not advocating that change. Maybe it could include U.S. nationals. I don't know. I haven't thought that out, but
Okay, thank you for that answer. I'd like to just touch on the fraud question just
Yeah.
a moment. It seems as you were talking about that most of the fraud cases are actually people that are the fraud cases that are identified are actually people who are double voting at some level, either within New Hampshire or Massachusetts and New Hampshire or something like that.
I think that's right. The Attorney General's office would be more definitive on that because they conduct the investigations and like may have secret investigations I don't know about. But I think that that's right.
I know at least from the voter integrity groups often talk about concerns when there has been a municipality or a town of some sort who have had more votes than voters after an election, and there have been two communities cited that I'm familiar with
Yeah.
on that matter. Would you care to comment on that, or
Honestly, I would direct that to the secretary. Sorry to put you on the spot. I don't think that's what's happening. I don't know. But I'm not. I guess I don't specifically know what you're talking about, so I would refer
Okay.
that to someone else.
so that's a fair response. And the Saucedo versus Gardner. How do you spell Saucedo?
S. Do you mind if I?
Oh, please.
I can pull this up and probably give you the site. Saucedo.
Saucedo. Thank you.
Yep, versus Gardner, and that's
That's our own Bill Gardner, correct? Is that?
yes,
yeah,
yes, indeed. That's a 2018 case from the District of New Hampshire.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
We'll look at that as well, I suppose. So. All right, I don't see any further questions from
Great.
the subcommittee at this time. Thank you very much, Mr. Clementine.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak with you. It's been
We
a
appreciate that.
delight. And anyone on this subcommittee or anyone should feel free to reach out to me with any email by questions. I'm Henry at aclu-nh.org. I'm happy to answer any questions for the committee's convenience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, did you have any follow-up comments after hearing that testimony and some of the follow-up questions that the subcommittee had that you'd like to comment on? I'd offer you that opportunity at this time.
Yeah, I don't have any follow-up comments other than, the issue of more votes than voters on the checklist. I mean, there are reasons why that happens, and after every election, we kind of go through the return of votes and the moderator reports just to try and, figure out what those discrepancies are. It can be anything from counters not understanding that when trying to think things like when the ballots go through the ballot counting device and they get kicked out for a write-in vote that might be on that ballot. Sometimes they think that they have to count every race on that ballot and not just the write-in. So sometimes we get, double counting in situations like that. And then because we have same-day registration, and in some elections, there are very large numbers of election day registrants, the number of votes in that election may show very high in relation to the number of voters on the checklist before they add those into the process. So it's usually human error that causes that And, we do our best to clean that up after the election.
So, so if I may just ask a follow-up question to that. So, because I think that would be very helpful for voter integrity groups or whatever to understand. So, if there are a large number of same-day registrants, there's actually sort of a lag time for the checklist to catch up to those additional same-day registrants being added onto the checklist. And so,
There could be, just
There
depending
could
on
be,
how the
could be.
reporting takes place at the local level.
how long would you anticipate that lag time to be? If there's if they're writing this information in, how quickly should they be updating that back to your office?
Hopefully it's all cleaned up within, 60 days after the election, but it is a large process of certifying the returns after the election is over. I mean, that is done usually within a week, but sometimes there are corrections that are made at the local level, and that information trickles in sometimes after the formal process is complete. We do make those adjustments when when we become aware that an error has been made, but those are the types of things that cause those numbers to be the way they are.
Thank you. Well, I think that's very helpful information. Yes, Representative Burton.
Sorry, thank you for taking my question. So the supervisor of the checklist, do they have a deadline as to when they need to update the first-time registration voters? Not first time, but yes, same day registration voters. Is there, you said about 60 days, but is there an actual time period they have to have that submitted to you?
I don't believe there is a hard date in the statute, other than they have to have their checklist ready before the next election takes place. So in the case of a town where you have a state general election in November, they have to have their checklist prepared and ready to go for March local elections. So all of that work needs to be done. Cities may take longer because most of the cities don't have their elections until November, really a year after the election process. From our perspective, it's important to get that information updated as quickly as possible. And, and we do request that, but there is no hard deadline for when they have to have that done.
Can I have a follow-up here? So would you prefer to have a date that's a hard date within a certain time period? Would that be helpful to the office, your office?
Well, it would be helpful for the office, but I am always cognizant of the workload that is on the local election officials. And, I don't want to, sometimes they need pushed, but many of them already are working very hard to get those jobs done. And they're pretty much volunteers. So,
Right.
We want to work with them on the time frame.
Okay, thank you.
If I may ask a follow-up question to that, it would 90 days after a general election and 60 days after other elections be appropriate? I'm just thinking about the large volume of voters that we have during the November general elections versus typically a much lower response or turnout during the local elections. Would those sorts of timeframes be acceptable to the Secretary of State's office? I'm sure the Municipal Association would have something to say about, but is that the sort of time frame that you might be looking for to have checklists updated?
Instead of having a rigid deadline, I think it would be preferable to work with the supervisors of the checklists and the clerks, just helping to support them in that role so that they can get it done as quickly as possible, as opposed to, because as you mentioned, elections are all different. Local elections, lighter turnout, state primaries, certainly lighter turnout than general elections, and a general election without president versus one where we're voting for, those are also very different. So flexibility, I think, is good.
All right, thank you for your response. I appreciate that.
Just a quick follow. When you said that they had to get it by the next election, would an SB2 deliberative session count as that next election as well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we're done here. Thank you. Okay. All right, I don't, I think this has been very helpful to hear perspectives this morning about the kind of legal precedents and other concerns with both the state interest to have elections that are safe and secure, as well as the burden imposed on the right to vote. So I think those are really kind of the balancing factors that we're trying to consider here, and really appreciate the testimony from the Secretary of State's office and from the ACLU. So thank you very much for that. We are I think what I'm going to do is just have the committee take a quick break till maybe 11:15, and then we'll resume, and we might have a little changing of the guard. I know one of our members has to leave for some other community commitments, and we have another representative who is going to be coming back after county delegation obligations being fulfilled this morning. So we'll resume at 11:15 by my watch, so that is about 12 minutes from now. So thank you very much. break for anyone who might be watching, what I'd like to do is go over some bills. We've sort of gone over some of the legal precedents this morning, looking closely at some recent opinions from the Supreme Court of New Hampshire and a case that was litigated in 2019 and 2020, Casey versus the New Hampshire's Secretary of State. And we heard testimony from the Secretary of State's office and from the ACLU this morning regarding different aspects. I think what struck me was really trying to find a balance between the state's interest to have safe and secure elections versus the burden imposed on the right to vote. I think that is sort of the key aspects that this committee needs to consider. At least one of the aspects that the committee needs to consider is making sure that we appropriately balance those aspects. Now, I think we have, last week we discussed bills pertaining to RSA 659-13. There were at least 4 of them that we discussed, and we, as well as we worked on one and moved that along because basically it had, while some good ideas, it was really addressing the concept of domicile in the wrong area of the RSA. For now, what I'd like to do is let's look at, there's a couple of bills that, there's one bill that specifically talks to 654-12, and that is Bill 365. Let me, so I'd like to just briefly look at that. And then hopefully Representative Lane can come and join us soon, and we can go over her bill 385. But this is I think germane because this pertains to the proof of citizenship, which we just discussed with Mr. Clementotes from the ACLU. So if I may just discuss this bill briefly, it's a new paragraph, voter identification, proof of citizenship, and they were inserting a paragraph 2. If a person claiming to be qualified to vote is unable to provide reasonable documentation, establishing that the person is a citizen of the United States, at the request of such person, the supervisors of the checklist, city or town clerk, or authorized election officials shall attempt to confirm the citizenship through the office of the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State can then make reasonable efforts to determine if they are a U.S. citizen by accessing relevant and available in-state, out-of-state, and federal databases that contain such information. However, if the request to verify citizen status is made on election day, neither local election officials nor the Secretary of State shall be required to expend such time or effort on citizen verification as would unreasonably interfere with other election day duties. If the person's United States citizenship is verified, they shall notify the Secretary of State shall notify the local election official, and the citizenship criteria for voting shall be deemed satisfied. The local official shall then note on the person's voter registration application form, U.S. citizenship verified, and shall indicate on that form the date and the basis on which such verification is made. So I think just that's the first part before I continue on with paragraph B. I think that looks to be a fairly clear balance between trying to meet the state interest for the qualifications of the voter, but without imposing an unreasonable burden on the person who has that right to vote. at least from a legislative perspective. Then Part B, just continuing on, if a person claiming to be qualified to vote asserts that she is unable to due to indigency to provide documentation to establish that he or she is a United States citizen, and if efforts to verify the person's citizenship pursuant to subparagraph A are not successful, the city or the town clerk or the Secretary of State may request such a person to complete a financial affidavit on a form developed for this purpose by the Secretary of State. So if a person does not have the resources or wherewithal to be able to pursue documentation of citizenship, then they may make a appropriate application. And then if based on criteria established by the Secretary of State, it appears that the person qualifies as indigent, the clerk or the secretary may provide the person with a voucher sufficient to cover the cost for the person to obtain a certified copy of the person's birth certificate or other equivalent documentation to establish that status as a United States citizen. The person shall be specifically informed that it is the person's responsibility to communicate with the appropriate vital records agency in the state of the person's birth and to use the funds provided through the voucher to pay any required fee to obtain the person's birth certificate or equivalent proof of citizenship. Such documentation shall be provided to the local election officials on or before the day of election in order for the person to satisfy the citizenship criteria for voting. And then the Secretary of State shall reimburse local municipalities for the cost of all vouchers issued by the city or town clerks pursuant to the subparagraph. So, and then the rest of it is concerning financial matters, which we will not go into at this for this subcommittee. So, from that perspective, I think that again is trying to ease what might be perceived as an unreasonable burden imposed on the right to vote. Certainly this makes provisions to make it much easier for an indigent person to obtain the information as needed if it cannot be obtained under the aspects as mentioned in subparagraph A. So any comments or thoughts on this particular House bill at this point? Representative Jameson.
Thank you. It's hard to say where to start on this because it's first off, I guess we heard overwhelming testimony against this bill in about a ratio of 10-1 against, including all the online submissions. The in-person testimony, we did not hear from the sponsor about this bill at all, so it's hard to say. There was no give and take questioning there. The aspect of an affidavit saying I'm poor is, I find it hard to believe that we would accept an affidavit saying I'm poor, but not accept one saying I'm a citizen and able to vote and qualified, is one issue I have with that. Another one is that the voucher programs, we heard testimony that it would really only be applicable to folks who were born in New Hampshire, which is, we heard it was about a third of New Hampshire voters were born here. And almost 80% of women's birth certificate doesn't match their name when they get married and change their name. So query whether that proves their citizenship. That then they would need another document possibly, which would be the marriage certificate or Social Security documents showing the name change, which then adds more and more costs and burden to do that. And the last thing that's coming to my mind at this point in time is that this basically, I think, would kill same-day registration. And if we want to do that, that's a policy decision, but this is not the way to do that. in that it does provide that, yes, you can do it on the same day, but there's no way that the Secretary of State would, I think, be able to handle the requests to make that happen. And as we all know, justice delayed is justice denied. So if we have a plan in place that then prevents somebody from same-day registration that is not workable on that same day, they would be denied the right to vote unnecessarily. So there's all kinds of problems I find with this bill. So
Representative Burnham, you have
Thank
a
you,
comment?
Mr. Chairman. Yes. I don't recall, like, how is this an issue? Like, do we see many of these issues where an indigent needs proof of citizenship? Like, I'm just trying to understand where this is coming from. Can you help me with that?
I believe this is in response to last session's House Bill 1569, which took away the ability to swear under penalties of perjury that you are a U.S. citizen. And it's trying to fix that aspect of it, is my belief, but I'm not 100% sure.
I see.
It's in response to a bill from last session, though.
Yeah, it is on House Bill 1569, I believe. I think they're trying to clarify the requirements for the proof of citizenship. So just again, to reiterate, there is already well established and this was part of the conversation with Mr. Clementowitz, is there is already a well established requirement that for citizenship, and so in order to vote in elections, and New Hampshire, unlike some other states, does not allow non-citizens to vote. So that is a proper qualification for a voter in New Hampshire. The issue at hand then becomes not, is that qualification improper, but does the proof of that qualification by the voter impose an undue hardship versus the state interest to keep elections safe and secure by making sure that, in fact, that person is indeed a citizen. So I think obviously this is a process of refining exactly how we can best find, I think someone used the term sweet spot, balance between that requirement to document citizenship versus the efforts required to provide that documentation. So I think that is what this bill is attempting to do, and has made and has tried to anticipate if a person may have difficulty providing that due to a resource aspect of some sort. We think about, maybe there are homeless populations and other people who may have those sorts of issues at that time. So I think that's what this bill is attempting to do. I appreciate your comments, Representative Newsom, on the challenges that you see with this particular bill. I think those the Election Law Committee will certainly have to consider that as once from an executive session standpoint, and then we should consider some of those aspects in our reports as well from the subcommittee.
And I'd also be willing to bet that that is the subject of the lawsuits that Mr. Clementowicz was not able to discuss.
Discuss.
I'm not 100% sure, but I'd be willing to bet that is that 1569 is the subject matter of those. So I'm sure we'll see guidance at some point from the judicial branch.
Indeed, perhaps, one never knows. And we will, the subcommittee will not attempt to forecast the future. So
Nor should we wait on those
Exactly.
results.
exactly, we'll leave that to other folks to do so.
But I would also like to just
yes.
add that I do agree with you that citizenship is a required element of registering to vote and is a valid state concern. I just wanted to say that I'm not disagreeing with you on that. So we are in agreement on at least one thing.
Right. I'm sure, as the public should know, is indeed the majority and minority parties agree on probably 70 to 80% of the legislation. Unfortunately, it's the disagreements that make the news, and therefore that's what the public hears about the most. But in fact, there's much that we agree on. So, but I appreciate the recognition of the agreement on citizenship qualification. So thank you for that. All right. Representative Lane has not joined us, but I do really feel compelled to some degree to start in on what is our longest bill, which is RSA 654, which is, I'm sorry, House Bill 385, of which there are a number of different sections within the bill pertaining to multiple parts of the RSA. So
I did just get a text from her saying she left about 3 or 4 minutes ago from her county meeting.
okay.
Which is just the county offices are just down the road. So I would anticipate her arrival shortly, depending on where she parks.
Okay. Yes. Good point. Let's then go to, let's look at, if we may, we'll look at 217, which I think really parallels some of our discussion from 365. If we have time, we may do one other quick bill, and then by that time, I'm sure Representative Lane will be here, and we can go over the 385 at that point. So let's look at 217. I'll just describe that briefly for whoever's listening. So this has to do with the absentee registration affidavit. So as this subcommittee has talked about, there are really two processes that we're concerned about. Is one is registration, the other is receiving the ballot or obtaining the ballot, which on election day is the check-in process. But of course, for the absentee ballot, that varies a little bit. We heard some testimony from the Secretary of State on that this morning. So let me just go over that. So this has us amending RSA 654-17 to read as follows. It shall be prepared, the absentee registration affidavit shall be prepared by the Secretary of State and shall contain, I'll paraphrase, contain the following information. They attest that they attest to a series of things and swear or affirm under the penalties of voter fraud. They attest that they are, one, a citizen of the United States. They establish their legal domicile is in a town or city. I'll be age, proper voting age on election day and entitled to vote in the election to be held in said town on such and such a date. Except for the fact that that the name does not yet appear on the checklist to be used in the said town at such election. So they essentially are not yet registered and are attempting to register and obtain absentee ballot. All right, goes on stating their absence. In part 2, I do not intend to be present within said town at such time prior to said election that will allow that person to appear before the supervisors of the checklist and in their regular sessions for the correction of the checklist for said election. So the process is, if you're registering, the supervisors of the checklist normally have these sessions where you can go in and register with them. And so if you're anticipating voting in the next election, you can go in and register with the supervisors of the checklist. But if you are absent, how do you do that? So this allows that process to occur. And then they explain their temporarily residing in city and state, or city, province, and country. And then they enclose copies of the documentation required by RSA 654-12, again, the qualifications to vote that establish citizenship, age, domicile, and identity as qualifications to vote. And then they acknowledge that if they do not provide a copy as required of the documentation as required by Section 4 above, the application shall not be approved. And then I hereby make application for this. So this is really for the voter who is not yet registered in a town or city ward, who because of their circumstances will be away from that town or city ward during the supervisors of the checklist sessions, and therefore will not be able to pre-register in that manner. And of course will also be away during the election day itself, and so will not be able to register on by the same day election day registration process. So they are registering by absentee registration. And then it goes into penalties if they do not do that, and basically the same thing. And the next page has basically the same sort of thing, and then it explains why. The next page really covers the same aspects, but then describes, goes into some detail in subparagraph 2, why they cannot appear before that on election day. So, and this has to do primarily with the affidavit for a physical disability. So, and then on the third page, this is the signature of the witness to support that. And then there are some other RSAs that are amended as well. 654-19, the submission effect. And and this covers the supporting documentation when it's provided. And then down in subparagraph 3, verification of an in-person absentee voter. And then just talks about providing voluntarily a photo identification that meets the requirements, voter verification, and then provisions that if they do not present a qualified photo ID, they will not be treated as a verified voter. And that is that. So I think, so this is a bill that sort of tries to align the verification of the voter qualifications for people who cannot apply in person to the supervisors of the checklist or will be absent on the day of voting, and therefore not eligible for making, or not present to be able to make a same-day registration in that case. So that's what this particular bill, House Bill 217, pertains to. So as we've heard, I think again the greatest challenge or hurdle is the documentation for citizenship that we've heard discussed this morning. So I think that's most of the rest of this seems to be fairly straightforward. I think that, but that is the I'm sure that is the one point that would be of some concern, and how do we make sure that we enable the right to vote without creating an undue burden. Any comments from the subcommittee? Welcome, Representative Lane.
Sorry for being late.
No, that appreciate the obligations that representatives also have as county delegates. Not everyone understands that, so that's worth mentioning. So
I have a question, just
Yes.
because I missed all of this and I haven't had a chance to watch all the tape, but did someone speak about citizenship
Yeah,
and
yes.
the history? I'm going to watch the tape, so
Sure.
you don't need to tell me, but I just want to make sure that somebody had spoken to it and that everybody had the information that they needed.
yeah,
Okay.
if I can, I'll try and summarize it in 2 or 3 sentences. Is no one questions the no one questions citizenship as a qualification for the right to vote in New Hampshire. That is well established, and Mr. Clementoitz from the ACLU recognized that, and that's been long settled in other court cases, not including any of the recent ones that are that Mr. Allen identified in his research memo. That goes beyond. That's long established. What was discussed most is some voters will have some challenges providing proof of their citizenship. And while this subcommittee does not choose to speculate on pending legislation or pending litigation, it's quite possible that some of the pending litigation discusses that. The 3 documents that provide proof of citizenship are a birth certificate, naturalization papers, a passport, when there are changes to names because of marriage or other things, there might be additional documentation required, a marriage certificate, for example, or some legal order to change one's name. And so one of the discussions that was talked about was, the state has a legitimate interest to make sure that their elections are safe and secure, that only qualified voters are voting. And that is, no one contests that. The challenge is then, is an undue burden being imposed on the right to vote. And some burden is tolerable. That we have to provide those documents as needed, but it's an intolerable burden that is, I think, part of the question here. And what do you do in certain circumstances when people are not able to immediately provide that information? Do we make provisions for that? All right. So are there any comments at this point on 217? House Bill 217.
I know that I didn't participate or hear, but I'm relatively familiar with the issue, not totally, but in the United States as a country, we have for years satisfied this by an affidavit. And in federal elections and in state elections. And now it's become an issue. And I guess I'll ask the Attorney General this when they come, but do we know that, because the penalties for someone who is not a citizen to basically lie and say they are a citizen are severe. Not only are state penalties,
Right.
but the fact probably that they violated federal and they may well be deported. And they probably will never become a U.S. citizen because this will be a felony. And so they will not be able to pass the citizenship requirements for naturalization. So I guess I come back to, why do we need this bill? And what is that burden that you mentioned? What is that? Because the ramifications of lying about this are just so high. Why would anyone ever do it? I don't know if anybody talked about that before,
So-
or that came up in the conversations, but those penalties are it's like a $5,000 or a $7,000 fee for state level. It's I think it's a felony even in the state. Or at least a misdemeanor, and on a federal level, it's even higher.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think one of the things that was discussed is that there are some, not within New Hampshire, but there are other states that currently have, or recently have permitted non-citizens voting in local elections. And again, hypothetically or theoretically, you could anticipate someone from that locale moving to New Hampshire and maybe not understanding that New Hampshire laws are different and then acting upon that. I mean, as a hypothetical only. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility, but I think also because of I think because of the border control issues with people coming into the U.S. without maybe the normal controls. I think there was a concern that there might be people who would be voting, people who would be illegal immigrants would have maybe less of a qualm of voting since they're here illegally anyway. But and I think that's sort of the rationale for, or that's the concern I've heard expressed, is that if someone is here illegally, then the threat of deportation does not increase with voting, and you can actually influence elections in your favor. Really with no change to current consequences. So that, again, we're talking hypotheticals. So
Right. And I also would, if I was that person, I think you'd be more likely to be found if you're registering and you're providing, first of all, you'd have to get a fake ID. You'd have to get a lot of fake stuff. And then you're going to go on and you're going to be on the rolls with an address. So if somebody wanted to come and deport you, you've kind of just raised a red flag, said, here I am. So in some ways, maybe they even have less of incentive. But, and I guess it comes down to, in my mind, when you talk about these theoretical problems, I think somebody testified that there was 9% of the population generally don't have these documents readily available. And we had a lot of testimony before about that too. I think maybe it was last year, I don't remember. But I guess the question comes down to is it worth saving those maybe 5 or 6 people who come in and keep out 9% of our voters? I mean, that's to me, when you talked about the balance or the burden, how many people are you willing to disenfranchise in order to catch a theoretical person who might be trying to vote? I'm just framing it that's how I think about it. It's like, how many people do we disenfranchise before we say it's worth it?
is there, so you've already said that you do agree that citizenship is a call with, so, right, and it has been for a long time. So if we then have established that we are going to verify that as a qualifying, or we will require proof of that, and we allow ample notification, and we allow provisions to say that, okay, if I don't have this immediately, I can fill out according to 217, I will supply this information. At some, I guess I would ask, at some point, doesn't this have to be, this information should be available at some point, right?
Well, I guess we've gone since 1787 without having it, without undue problems. So why not, we have an affidavit right now that people have been signing with no problems. And we have penalties that exist, that if you lie, then there's a big penalty. So in my mind, why require somebody to come? I mean, first of all, it takes months.
Right.
And to get naturalization papers is very expensive. I mean, people have tossed around numbers like $500, $600 to get them. And yet we're having them lose their most important right because they can't find these papers. I mean, and not everyone has easy access to a lot of stuff. So part of me says, if you catch somebody, and we have lots of people watching the polls, and the Attorney General's staff is there watching the polls, and we have moderators checking people in. And if you have an affidavit and you're swearing on the affidavit, Why is that still not good enough? Why do we need this extra documentation when even the federal government doesn't require it?
I think what we've heard, I think it was Mr. Richard who testified that what we have is not really the classic legal affidavit, but is instead a self-verification document. And that we've actually moved away from the full legal definition of an affidavit. Again, I'd have to review my notes on his testimony regarding the affidavit, but I do believe that there are some people who do have some concerns with what the RSAs currently call an affidavit. So,
Right.
but again, I'd have
Yeah,
to.
I did. I remember his testimony, and what I started looking through the election law RSAs, and there's a lot of instances of affidavits with people swearing under penalty, that they, first of all, it's penalty of perjury. Then there's going to be penalty of the laws, of the election laws, and which enable them to, like, it's a misdemeanor. One is a $5,000 penalty. There's a felony and a criminal, and then there's civil, I can't remember the exact details, but there's plenty of penalties built in, and we can write an affidavit that would do that. So I would want to look at his statement, because I'm not sure, because we've had these affidavits and people have been prosecuted on these affidavits. And again, when we get the Attorney General in here, we can ask them about that. But if you're signing something and saying you're attesting to and you're affirming and you're subject to the penalties and you're signing it, whether you have a witness or not, you've signed it. You'd have to prove that that's not your signature. I mean, and somebody's I'm not sure that I want to look at it, because I think you could craft an affidavit that would work. And that would be much easier for people to sign. And particularly if they're doing same-day registration, they're signing it in front of somebody after they've already showed their identification, right? Do I have the process? They've already showed, if we're doing same-day registration, they've showed their ID. Now they're proving, now they have to prove
Right.
domicile and citizenship and these other things. So if they can sign an affidavit as to citizenship, the person who's doing the same-day registration is there in front of them. And so they have their ID. So they can't come back and claim that wasn't me unless there's a fake ID. And then then whoever this person is going to be liable for, you can throw the book at them.
It is. So I'm just thinking through that is, if they're able to prove, if they have a proper ID, they can show evidence of domicile and age. What are you saying then with regard to citizenship?
Sign an affidavit, right? I mean, that's what we do now.
And then at what, but the affidavits are often in the process where we've had these affidavits before, you were then required to provide proof subsequently. You're required to provide evidence within 7 days or something like that. If, in the, so at some point, do you not have to provide proof of citizenship?
I've never had to. And I got my birth certificate. Oh, when I got my passport, I had to prove it. And the hospital that I was born in had burned down. And so it was an exercise to find it. And it definitely took me more than a month. And it definitely took me more than a week. So, and I know, I mean, somebody testified last year that they were adopted and they had no idea where they were born and they had no idea where to find a birth certificate. And I'm suspecting that's not an unusual circumstance. So again, how many people do we disenfranchise because we're scared that somebody's going to come in and commit fraud? And again, I want to ask the AG's office, you know, if he's aware of anything in New Hampshire. And I guess, you know, are there people, I'm assuming this must be happening nationally, but where is it? You know, where is it happening? And if it's not really happening, then why do we need to solve a problem that's not there? Because it's not happening.
Oh, okay. It is a bit of a dilemma. Here we have a qualification for which we need no evidence. So that it's an interesting perspective. We have a qualification for which we need no evidence.
Well,
So-
the evidence is the person who's signing the affidavit under punishment of law. You know, and I don't know. I mean, to me, we've never had to do that in New Hampshire since the Constitution was put in until recently. And in that time span, I don't know, math's not my strong point, but roughly 200 years, we've never really had a problem. So if we've never really had a problem with the citizenship piece, then why do we need to make people go through this exercise if it's not been a problem? Or if they can't prove it or they don't have the documentation, then sign an affidavit. And if we really want to go after people and if we find out they've not voted correctly or they're not a citizen, because my understanding, there's no one place that you can go in the federal government to find out if somebody is a U.S. citizen. And we ran into this last year when we were trying to do bills, because I think it was Senator Gray who wanted to rely on federal databases to prove this. But then it came out during the hearing that there's really nowhere to do that. I mean, if that was something that was easy to do, sure, you can verify it. But right now, that's not something that's easy to do. And not all the supervisors can get to that statewide or that federal database on the election day because of connectivity issues.
Right. And actually, I think House Bill 217 does address that aspect, because they recognize that there would be concerns with election day duties as well, that trying to close the loop on the evidence of citizenship on an election day is something that would be overly burdensome for the election officials because of their duties. And so therefore there were allowances to cure is not probably the correct term, but to address that subsequently. So all right, so I think that's we may actually have the evidence of citizenship may actually be a good question for our esteemed researcher. So I will, Mr. Allen, I will try and craft a well-worded question to you and ask for you to research if there are other states that are requiring this sort of evidence of citizenship, and what are the provisions that they...
I will gladly rely on somebody's better research than mine, but a quick Google search has showed that there's only 8 states require proof of citizenship, one of which, Kansas, is not being enforced because of a court decision. So we are in the extreme minority of states there.
Well, as Yes, and New Hampshire as was mentioned earlier, has its own unique aspects.
We are included as one of those 8 states on this
Yeah.
list,
So-
saying that we require first-time voters to present proof of citizenship when registering. So we are included in that list of 8, as in that minority of states.
Yes, that was in HB 1569, which was passed last year.
All right, so we will, I will craft a question for our researcher to look into that and see what we can find. And the relevant court cases as well.
And just for the record, the source that I was looking at is the NCSL.
Hmm. What's the C stand for? Net- Conference State Legislatures? Yeah, that's right. So, that's a good place to start just for comparison. But, so, we'll ask about that. You might get a couple of requests coming out as well. So, all right. Representative Lane. Well, we only have 20 minutes, and it's already 12:08 by my watch, 12:08. So I'm reluctant to have you cover a 19-page House bill I'd give you 1 minute per page. But would you prefer that we cover it on March 7th?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but I can say, and I think I sent to you the sections of the RCAs that were affiliated. And the short version of this is that it repeals 1569 and puts everything back the way it was before HB 1569 passed, which
I may be wrong. I don't remember 1569 being this extensive. I don't think it was 19 pages, was it?
all we did, well, OLS, yes, it was. That's why we were not happy with it. But and if it does more, that was not the intent. The intent was to repeal it. And so what OLS did was go back to the statutes before 1569 was enacted and put them back. So everything that it changed, we undid.
Okay.
So just
So
to make,
theoretically, if I took 1569 and took this bill, I could go,
you should be able to.
okay.
And if there's a mistake, then we can talk about that. But yeah, no, because I can blame OLS, but that's not really fair because, I'm in charge of,
Right.
the buck stops here.
Yep, exactly.
So, and yes, they were crunched, and yes, this was a huge thing, but they did an amazing job. They really were very good
Yes.
on this because this was not an easy lift.
So, so just as a assignment for the subcommittee then is in the intervening 2 weeks, let's go through
I'll go to
House Bill 1569 from last year, and then House Bill 384 is 385,
385, yeah.
385, and go through and do a comparison, make sure that there was nothing, no surprises, I guess. that
Yes.
Worked in, and it was truly taking it a true repeal where it was taking it back to the wording that was established beforehand.
Right.
Because that will be simpler to address and explain and discuss if we know that as the basis for our discussion.
Right. And it would be understandable because I forget the exact timing, but the timing between the governor approving it, I think I had 1 day left to file a bill. So if there is an error, I wouldn't be necessarily surprised given the rush, but we felt it was important to, because it had been anticipated he was going to veto it. And then he approved it. And so we had, I think, 1 day to file.
Right, right.
So that's why I'm just
Right.
saying, it would not necessarily surprise me if we find a few snafus,
Okay.
but that's the intent.
Well, right. And so, I think this committee on, for, this subcommittee, should do that as part of the, under our scope of responsibilities so that we can report back up to the main committee. Any discrepancies we might find with that premise that you outlined. And then, again, I'm sure after our discussions, we'll have interesting reports to give back to both a majority and minority report to send up to the ELC as a whole, as to what our recommendations might be.
And so how should I get the list of all the statutes, all the sections affected to everybody? Is that something that you can send to the subcommittee? I don't want to violate
Why
any
don't I?
391
what-
issues, so.
Well, why don't I just,
What if I read them out?
yeah, why don't you read them out?
Okay,
then
and that,
you
that
can-
way
That way,
people can look at them and it's in the record.
it's in
and-
the
okay.
record and we can, then, start the discussion on the 7th and we'll go into it
Okay.
in detail and see what, if everyone has done their proper homework, we'll see what
I'm sorry.
people are finding out in terms of the comparison.
Okay,
So go ahead, please.
all right.
Yes.
So 654:12 is on page 1. 654:7 is on page 7. 654:7-A is on page 14. 659:27 is also on page 14. 659:27-A is on page 15. 659:13 Roman numeral 1 parentheses small c is page 17. 659:13 Roman numeral 2 parentheses B through E are on page 18. And the last one is 5:6-D Roman numeral 2, and that's on page 19.
Could you repeat that last one?
5:6-D as in dog, Roman numeral 2.
So the last RSA that you mentioned is not within the election law, it's 5?
No, I can't remember exactly, but it was in Representative Lynn's bill. So I can't remember which one that I can look it up.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not the same RSA statutes that defined
No.
resident or residency. So, and we didn't hear that in our discussion.
Yeah, it's a cross-reference.
Chapter 5 is Department of State,
Yeah,
so it'll probably be Secretary of State.
Secretary of State's responsibility.
it's a reference to the HAVA Act.
HAVA.
so
Okay, all right.
So I think so it has to do with HAVA.
Yes.
And there was a cross-reference that they put in or took out. I can't remember now, but it's the cross-reference to that.
Okay. Right, so there are, probably some provisions under HAVA that we need to make sure we address. So, all right. Is there, at this point, I don't think, because of the time, we only have about 11 minutes left or so. I'll just ask the subcommittee if there are any further comments, and if not, we'll end today's working session. Again, I think we've had a lot of testimony today on the legal precedents and some of the history behind that, and some discussions about domicile and residency, and how they are now essentially the same, based on I believe it was 2018's House Bill 1264, as well as subsequent court cases, the 2020 decision of Casey versus Secretary of State, and a number of 4 questions were answered regarding that. And so again, anyone who wants to follow up on that, that would be I think important to understand that that's certainly think one of the hallmark cases that we need to consider as we try and summarize positions on this. So I'll just go around the room. Representative Newsom, any comments or considerations for this subcommittee?
At this point, I'm gonna say I think we've covered it, and we still have a lot of work to do ahead, and look forward to getting into the nitty gritty and looking at some of the broader policy considerations as we go forward, and applying those policy considerations to create consistent, fair, and achieving the goal of secure elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Newsom. Representative Burnham, any comments or considerations for the subcommittee?
I do not have any comments or questions, but it's been very informative having guests here to explain certain procedures and things like that. So I think that's going to help us to determine what we need to do moving forward. I guess that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Burnham. Representative Lane, I know you're a late entry here, but and you still have some video watching to do.
Yes, I do.
But are there any comments or considerations you'd like to offer?
I would just echo Representative Newsom's comments.
All right, duly noted. Thank you very much. All right. So at this point, we will meet again on March 7th. We will not be meeting next week. I will send a request or two out to our researcher, Mr. Allen, certainly one regarding which states require evidence of citizenship, what do they require, and are there any relevant court cases that we know about? But I'll put that in an email to you, Mr. Allen. Thank you. And I may have some other questions as well, with some interesting questions about public notaries were raised today, and in the context of, I believe, absentee voters. So we may, I may have some questions along that line too. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for, yes.
Oh, just one other thing. Just wanted to double check that you would be inviting the Elections Law Bureau from, or whatever they're called,
Yeah.
from the Attorney General's office.
Yes, Deputy Secretary Hennessy was kind enough to provide a contact person
Great.
for that. We will see if they respond. So
Invitations are one thing. Attendance is
right,
another.
right. Yes, it is. Unfortunately, yeah, it's not a subpoena, that's for sure. So,
I was just saying, if we can't get them, maybe we could just maybe we could come up with lists of questions.
yeah,
Yeah, we'll send interrogatories. There you go.
yeah, that, So actually, that's a great suggestion. If there is a list of questions, if people on the subcommittee, I'll send a note to Representative C. But if there are a series of questions that we would want to present to the Attorney General's office regarding election law, why don't we come up with those, and then if those we can discuss them, and if the Attorney General office cannot come by the 7th, maybe we can send them ahead of time. Maybe we can have we'll see if we need to have another quick meeting with the subcommittee to
Meet with them.
pardon me,
To meet with them.
to meet with them. Yeah. So we'll see what can be done. But all right. Well, thank you everyone, and have a wonderful school vacation week. Yes.
Are you going to be here? I'll be here too.
All right.